There's a lot of talk now in the papers about, revisiting the 18th Amendment. I think that'll be a huge mistake. 18th Amendment is important. It's there to stay. There are aspects of 18th Amendment that need fixing, and the most important of that is strengthening the provincial revenue base. And within that, property tax is absolutely pivotal. Property sector as a whole has grown enormously in the last 3 to 4 decades. And the growth of this sector creates a huge demand on public goods, which the governments have to deliver. And so property tax is much more in the nature of a service charge than a tax. And I think people need to understand that. In the richer countries, property tax accounts for 2 to 3% of the GDP, which is a substantial share of the overall tax revenue. In developing countries, it's less than half a percentage points of the GDP, and in Pakistan, it's half of that.
So this is a discussion that's happening, particularly to start a dialogue on how do we reform property taxes in the wider context of urban development, in the massive growth of urbanization that we are seeing in Pakistan and in KP. Cities, if you look at the 2017 census, particularly larger cities, have very high rates of growth in Pakistan. And that is leading to huge amounts of congestion in migration, land values going up. And what we have is emerging service delivery deficits. So if you look at, for example, the percentage of households with unimproved sanitation in urban KP, the last PSLM tells us that 1 in 5 households don't have any improved sources of sanitation. And only about 1 in 5 have access to more than 6 hours of drinking water a day. So how does kind of fiscal policy fit in within this wider ambit of urban growth and growing demand in public services?
SEED is a DFID-funded program working exclusively on KP, and Adam Smith is implementing the first component. And the focus of the component is to improve economic and urban planning in KP. So when we started our work with KP a few months ago, we have had various discussions with the policymakers, with civil servants in KP. And one thing was clear, that we kind of initiated our work in the midst of Corona COVID-19 pandemic. And I think what the provincial governments are feeling, and especially KP, is that federal transfers are kind of shrinking, and the importance of own source revenue and even private investment is felt at all levels. How can urban services be improved? And if, for instance, urban services are linked with a local revenue, can it lead to more willingness in taxpayers to pay their taxes? So I think that has a great potential when we talk about a local tax like UIPT, property tax. If you look at KP, the total UIPT collection is less than 2 billion, which is nothing, because we do know that KP has properties worth billions of rupees, and I think it's true for the whole of the country. So I think the scale is minuscule. When we look at the large urban centers in KP and also elsewhere in Pakistan, they have been expanding rapidly. And one direct consequence of that is that urban services kind of get diluted. People suffer from poor services. Urban property tax is incidentally one of the biggest tax levers that the government has to influence urban policy, to kind of promote vertical growth. We look at urban property tax in this country more in terms of the properties, the annual rental values and whatnot. But UIPT is also a very important tool of land value capture. When we think of land value capture, it's a larger discussion, but I do think that property tax is a key part of that discussion. And as the governments would need to find more money for development and to invest, I do think that these land value capture discussions would become more important.
In many of the places that I work, which is mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, is that it's an increasing push by cities in particular and local governments to actually now realize this own source revenue. And the increasing realization that, particularly now as we face a global economic crisis, external funds are drying up, other funds are drying up. And this is actually a particularly powerful tool that cities have. There was this realization that cities are growing really rapidly, and that is going to require services and infrastructure for the government to invest. But that requires money. And that money has to come from somewhere. Someone has to pay for that. And I think the other part is that the investments that are made by government increase the value of these properties even more. And that is actually a public investment rather than any private investment. And so how you tax the properties is really just being able to take the publicly created value and being able to reinvest that again.
The fundamental reason for existence of the state is that the state provides citizens services. How does the state afford these services? Well, citizens have to come together to pay for these services. Hence, the idea of linking taxes with services becomes inherent. So how does the state raise resources primarily? What is striking in countries like Pakistan and developing countries in general is not just that the property tax is so small. All our taxes are small relative to developed country taxes and tax collection. But it's actually even in that benchmark. So if you look at, let's say what contributions income tax or sales tax makes vis-a-vis property tax between developed and developing countries, you'll actually see that property tax underperforms even in a metric like that. So clearly this is a seriously underutilized tax. And when you add to this that this is the one tax which really has a hope for very clearly establishing the link between payments and services, I think it could be an incredibly powerful tax, not just for raising revenue for its own sake, but re-establishing trusts that the citizen may have in the state, which then has all these positive externalities on other kinds of taxes.
In our context, coming very quickly down to the Punjab case and perhaps even the KP case, this, like you said very rightly, is in most parts of the world predominantly local government tax. Now, to have this equation within the ambit of this tax, or other taxes also at the local government level, have this equation built up between the citizens and the state, the superstructure that you, or maybe the substructure, if you may, that you want or need for that is a very well-working, or even a working to a certain degree, local government system. That, unfortunately, is missing in the case of Pakistan, has been there probably in very sort of small pieces of time, but generally has been missing. Even when that existed, like in the decentralization in 2000s, which was by far probably the most empowered decentralization we had in Pakistan, at the devolution plan of 2000. This tax is collected by and most of the policy handles of this tax were with the provincial government. Now that totally shrank the space for that debate to be held at the town hall because they had no levers over policy.
But I think the common point we've seen is that it can be tremendously important wherever you can draw that line of sight between the citizens, the service provision, and the tax. You can start building the trust. And for me, it's almost like when you have that starting point in low tax compliance environments, you can use that almost like a gateway. Like you hear about gateway drugs. Can you have like a gateway tax that once the citizens establish that trust with government, that services can be provided in exchange for their levies or their taxes, you can then build that confidence to comply with other taxes as well, and that trust between government and the citizens.
I think there are two key issues that we have in terms of both in terms of the linkages, but also the importance of this tax. Unfortunately, I think primarily because the dependence on federal transfers has been so high that provincial taxes generally haven't really had the importance that they should have had, and own source revenue collection hasn't really had the importance within government that it should have had. As a result of that, I feel like we've kind of, property taxes true potential hasn't really been realized. And so because of that, you don't really have enough to show that service delivery to begin with. And as a result of that, what's actually happened is that linkages that you talk about, it's exactly, theoretically speaking, that's why 85% of this tax does go to local governments. The reason there is that linkage is broken is because most of that just goes into salaries. And so the service delivery portion of it that's supposed to create that confidence from the citizen side isn't really seen. And that's something that we're trying to address now. And then there are anomalies like Dr. Mushtaba mentioned, between the fact that one department or one like a local government system declares what is an urban area, another declares or decides, another set within the government decides what the tax rate is going to be then for that area. Another then decides what kind of, is it going to be a rental system or a different system and all. And so, and none of these are talking to one another, which is why then, like you mentioned, that in areas where some of these services might be needed and you can convince the citizens that if you pay, we can provide those services, the service provision authority might not have the authority to actually impose these taxes. And so then they depend on other departments for that kind of stuff. And so what we're trying to change, and in the current finance bill, we have done that, is to try and limit that as much as possible and kind of bring it together at some stage. And so we've taken a step in that direction exactly. And we're going to, one of the moves exactly is this, to try and get citizen involvement.
One of the questions in the session saying, look, people are willing to pay taxes. I think, you know, when people like Bhutto said Makan, I never took that to mean literally the house. I took that to mean amenities, which are related to living. And when you think of that, our citizens, I mean, have demonstrated massively that they're willing to pay a lot for that. I mean, your success of the Bahariya schemes and defense is a very stark manifestation for that, except sadly that money has not gone. It's gone to people in Vardis and it's gone to, you know, private contractors, not to the state. So there's a willingness to pay for this as well. So to Ali, to your point, you know, how does one establish the link? I think you have to start with the premise of not skepticism. It's not that, oh God, people will never do this, we're poor. I think people have demonstrated they will pay. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind, right? You know, this is analogous to, you know, the educational debate where, you know, are people willing to pay for quality education? Absolutely. The rise of the private sector has demonstrated that. I think the rise of housing societies in our urban areas across Pakistan has demonstrated people will pay, and pay a lot, for good amenities around where they're living. How do you jumpstart the process? You know, if you don't have the revenue to deliver the right services, if you don't have the logistical structure, which is what we are facing in Punjab as well, exactly what you said, there isn't a single authority. So we go running around trying to interface between the excise department, between the finance department, between the local government department, you know, between the planning and development department. And we end up playing this role, which really a local authority should have been unifying itself, right? But you need money. You know, the citizen is not going to, unfortunately, we are in a situation in Pakistan where the citizen isn't trusted enough, regardless of which government you have. So this is not a critique on this government. It's the last 50 years of Pakistan, which includes democratic, non-democratic, your favorite party, your favorite not party, whatever you want. It includes everyone. I don't think any one of them has been able to demonstrate the first mover of saying, okay, we know you don't trust us. Here's what we're going to give you for free, effectively, in lieu of the fact that you will give us something in future.
From my own city, one of the things, so in Kampala in Uganda, one of the decisions that was taken in 2011 was actually to split the revenue and the expenditure departments at a city level. And the reason being is that the understanding is it's always much easier to spend the money than it is to collect the money. And that has really strengthened a core group of people whose sole purpose it is to be able to collect revenue. And I think that was a really important innovation in that. And so on the one hand, obviously we want to link revenue to expenditures. On the other hand, we also have to recognize, again, particularly when we think about politics, it's always easier to spend. And I think that's another part where the politics of property tax is important to think about, and how you can sort of resist the pushback that you will get. Our law actually stipulates that at least 75% of what is raised from property tax has to go back into service delivery to avoid the challenge that Khazan was picking up about sort of the salaries and going into salaries. But again, if you think about it in absolute terms, it's still not enough to provide the infrastructure and services. I think a really good example of how you can do this linkage, perhaps even without needing to necessarily spend more, comes from Lagos in Nigeria. And when they reformed their land use charge, they did what Asim said. They went out to citizens and they said, hey, what would you like us to spend your money on? Except they had a predetermined list. So it was things that they were already spending money on. It's just that the citizen hadn't internalized that they were spending money on that. And so after they collected the property tax or the new land use charge, what they did is they put up big billboards and they said, your money was spent on this.
The opposition of provincial and national elected politicians to local government politicians is immense. They for multiple reasons that I won't go into, but that is why MPs and MNAs want to go and build streets, and they want to sort of, so there's a whole sort of local political politics around it, mostly of patronage and getting votes and all that. So here is what I put on the table. The provincial government, and this is what I found in my research, did not only actively, not only sort of ignored property tax or let it be, but it actively made efforts and actively did things like giving exemptions, huge exemptions that would ensure that local governments were denied additional resources.
The first step needs to be there. Proper elected local government systems accountable to the public need to be in place for us to then be able to do that. And my fear at this stage is that at this point, if we transfer that, the effect it's going to end up happening, because in our law, something like we've said that 30% of all development funds of the province, regardless of whatever they collect themselves, will be spent through the local government. The impact that might end up happening at a stage where we're trying to make property taxes and other taxes like these a real force or kind of to make a real difference, that amount being transferred directly to them from the province is going to be enough for them not to be willing to take that political hit of trying to collect these taxes. And the example I'll give why I think that is because right now, currently, when we don't have elected members, everyone is pushing us that now is the time to kind of add on new areas where we are giving municipal services, but they're not they don't fall under the property tax net. And they're saying that once you get elected members, they're never going to allow that to happen. Ideally, what you would want is that if it's a VC, whenever it's converted to a neighborhood council and the government is forced to give municipal services, that should automatically, property taxes should be charged on them. What percentage, whatever, we can talk about the rates. But at this point, that's not how it happens. There has to be a separate permission given. And so because of that, they've made their own system of measurement. They call it a ward. And there's no real definition of, one ward does not match in any way, shape or form to another one. And that's another area which we're trying to kind of look at to kind of standardize the way we measure these things. Apart from that, I think one of a really good question that Dr. Asim raised about how to kickstart it. We've kind of thought about that, and we're moving in the direction what Astrid talked about, that at least some percentage, even if it's 30-40% of the revenue at this point, we would say that it has to be spent on development. And in this year, during COVID, we're kind of trying to see the advantage of trying to get people to willingly pay, where we've actually connected all our own source revenue with being spent on COVID. The expenditure we're doing on COVID is very, it's very visible at this stage. And so we're hoping that kind of would be a good experiment for us to see if that increases willingly like payment and all?
In South Asia and in Pakistan, in India and most states, basically what you do is you tax built structures. You don't tax land. So there's very little land taxation that actually happens. And, you know, sort of there is a debate. Hassan also talked about it, about land value capture.
The constraints of using rental value is that it will only give you the tax based on what the best current use is, not what the best possible use is of that building. Land is actually even more efficient to tax than buildings, because if you tax buildings, you may disincentivize people to build. And so you may incentivize them rather to hold the land vacant and speculate. And that's a big problem in my own city. And we talked at the beginning about even, Ali, you mentioned in your sort of opening remarks about how you can use property tax as a tool beyond just the revenue generation. And I think that is you know, one challenge is when you tax just the structures, you may disincentivize sort of efficient use of the land.
For me, the issue is more two kind of criteria. One is operationally what's feasible, and that's what Astrid's point was right now. Capacity-wise, what data do we have which we can reliably get? And the second is, I think, the point Anjum raises, which is from an economic efficiency point of view, what is going to cause the least amount of distortion in an economy? And I think the principle of, you know, intermediate goods can be more distortionary. I think those are tough questions, but the right ones to ask. I should say one thing in this regard, which is, you know, I don't think we're anywhere near the optimal non-distortionary tax system. But we definitely have weird perversities in our current system. So for instance, the differential, there's massive differential, like between owner and self-occupied, between rented and owner-occupied. There's a massive difference in tax rates. So when you create things like that, especially on margins which are hard for you to actually verify, you're going to get very distortionary behavior. So my only kind of first request at this point would be to say, look, when they're massive rate differentials, realize it's going to create a massive distortion. So first try and either eliminate them, or if you think you can really justify them from an economics perspective and from a enforcement capacity perspective, then you can keep them. By incentivizing tax collectors, both through financial means, you know, performance-based systems, but also by introducing merit-based transfers and postings, both had pretty large effects on raising property tax, you know, on the order of like, you know, 60 to 70 to 80% increases. And also, not just that, but these increases were lasting. So the way, you know, we have to realize, at least in Punjab, the way it was is, you're not raising taxes by having higher recovery rates. Actually, recovery rates are pretty good on paper, right? You suppress tax base. That's where the action is. And we've alluded to already in these things. And so the main action came from raising the tax base without any change in tax rates. It's just you reassess a property the way it should have been, the rental versus versus owner occupied.